some sort of hysterical, the way they've denigrated significant actors in this area. And the people, we've got people like Andrew Bolt and Tony Abbott who are so successful and get so much support from the Murdoch press. It seems to be, I certainly understand your points, but it seems to be a sort of very practical problem in trying to achieve this sort of balance that we need to have.
Are we recording this? Then I might just...
I can. If you don't want me to, I'll just turn it off.
Yeah. What can I say? Sure. Yeah, that's a big problem. So having a very lopsided media landscape is a massive problem. And as we've seen, the so-called, what was called antisocial or non-social behavior that's not in compliance with perhaps the new norm or the morally sort of superior norm that we would like people to endorse. To have that sort of propagated like that, that's a real problem, because that encourages obviously people to not only to not take it seriously, but also it perhaps then gives the wrong impression again that there are more people who really don't care. And it's interesting. So yes, the debate is there's some real power imbalances, obviously. I mean, that's the whole problem. The reason we're caught up in this, because there's these massive power imbalances. They're not just and having the airspace that these outlets do and these individuals do is really a real challenge to this kind of campaign or to this kind of goal. So absolutely, and I guess that there's no easy fix, obviously, and philosophers wouldn't have one anyway. But I mean, all I can say is that if at the grassroots, if to the extent that we can at the grassroots level, combat pluralistic ignorance, we can still countervene and undermine those efforts. And I'm often surprised. I obviously teach at a university, and I'm often, I think when I started, I was a bit more cautious introducing the climate change topic until I realized the students are all on board. There is no debate. The young kids are all agree it's a problem. Unless there's perhaps one or two who don't dare speak up or something, that's possible, but it's not an issue. They're not sitting there and debating stuff. They're like, yeah, we need to change this. So it's interesting to see, perhaps we're even more convinced, perhaps there's even a perception of a greater influence of the press than is adequate. Perhaps they're not even having that level of influence because people can really see what's happening. I'm not sure. That's an empirical question, but certainly up against some formidable agents there, for sure. Yeah.
So the gentleman next.
Yeah, the audience question is there one practical solution to something, and it's difficult. This politically copy of the media thing is so entrenched that it's pretty profoundly depressing. Not collectively, but sort of willed ignorance and just ignoring science. Okay, another practical problem I wanted to see if you had an opinion about. I was thinking of this because of the apocalypse in California. This NIMBY problem, where for generations coastal California towns municipalities run by very wealthy people, say absolutely not. We're not having high-rise building, we're not having concentrated, dense populations in our town. And this has pushed many people eastwards in California into these sort of quasi-wilderness or semi-wilderness areas, which has, as these fires showed recently, really destabilized the ability of nature to deal with the human incursion. And a lot of the infrastructure, the electricity systems are very poorly and dangerously constructed. So in very hot weather, these fires happen much faster than they would ordinarily. If Gavin Newsom, governor of California, said to you, okay, I've got a lot of lawyers in property law and a lot of scientists I listen to and they're annoying me, what would you say? If he asked you, well, how can I change the attitude or the mentality of the coastal communities? Because they're absolutely resistant to changing the law so that they are forced to assume more of the burden for this population problem. how could you practically point out or explain how it's in their own interest to reform municipal law?
Yeah, I think, I don't have a good answer for it, to be honest, but one thing that I think we're encountering here, we can sort of look, obviously when we think about NIMBYs, people who think, oh yeah, it's important to do something about it, but I don't want to be doing something about it, I want everyone else to do something about it. And in fact, so there's an analysis of NIMBYs that I wrote a few years ago where I sort of compared a weak NIMBY with a strong NIMBY, and the weak NIMBY is the person who wants something to happen, let's say about climate change, but they're rather not be the person having to make a sacrifice, but they still prefer to be the person having to make a sacrifice over nothing happening at all. That's the weak NIMBY. But the strong NIMBY is the one who thinks that they'd rather prefer nothing happening over them being the person who has to make a sacrifice so that something can happen. So and I think that kind of scenario that starts resembling a bit of a prisoner's dilemma situation where it looks like the collectively suboptimal option is chosen in favour of one that would be individually and collectively better, which is what happens in a prisoner's dilemma. Now, in a prisoner's dilemma situation, I guess what you can do to resolve it is to change the incentive structure. That's sort of, so then you change chaos, but that means it's no longer a prisoner's dilemma. Or you can, I guess, I'm not sure you can play repeat games, because I guess we only live once. So one of the things, I guess one of the things that does suit a lot of people's incentives, and so often it is in economic incentives, and in this particular scenario, also, I guess, generating an environment where these issues, I mean, that's still a problem, obviously, with urban sprawl. And I guess one of the things that's not very attractive to people is that it still seems to work fine. There's no good alternative, perhaps, to more urban or at least high density living with the required infrastructure. So I think, again, that's probably way outside my area of expertise, but economists would probably say change the incentive structure, then obviously there's a way of thinking that goes with a kind of different public rhetoric as well. And I guess in the US, one of the main problems that we're seeing, and also in response to the pandemic, is that a public rhetoric that's based on very individualist notions of well-being seems to be inferior when it comes to tackling these issues. You're not going to people on board if it's each to their own. And I actually think whatever, even though there's obviously been mistakes made in the Australian pandemic response, but I found the public messaging that has been made by politicians in Australia has always emphasised the collective aspect of the problem, and has very often appealed to our collective difference-making capacity. And I think that when I heard those, I always thought that was very cool. So look, it's not all just in the thinking. Some of it is just really basic economic and other incentives, and good urban planning, good urban design, but that is, it basically, or that tries that can convey a credible, attractive vision of a future that is perhaps higher density, more focused on public transport, etc. And obviously, that's been possible in other parts of the world. But yeah, that's a hard one, because it seems that people's lifestyle, people's idea of what a good life consists in is often quite tied to those living around us, and I think it's very difficult to break through that.
Hi, and I was wondering how can the theory take into account, or how would it take into account actors that do seem to have an outsized share of responsibility for climate change and carbon emissions, such as certain companies and, for example, the super wealthy. So there was a report put out this Monday by Oxfam that details, it's called Confronting Carbon Inequality. And it talks about how the richest 1% of the world's population accounts for twice as much carbon pollution as the poorest half of the world's population. So the 1% accounts for greater pollution levels than 3.1 billion people. So do they have a greater share of responsibility, or like, what do we do with it?
Yeah.
Did everyone hear that question, by the way?
Does this, yeah, so the question is, how does one's share of responsibility when it comes to addressing climate change sort of increase potentially with one's causal responsibility for climate change? So to the extent to which we are polluting, what impact does that have on the extent to which we now have obligations to address the problem? And there's obviously been this Oxfam study showing how disproportionate our global emissions are. Yeah, sure. So one thing I didn't talk about at all is the distribution of burdens here, and that's obviously a big debate in both at the international climate treaties level, where basically a number of different principles are being adopted in order to determine what different countries, that's obviously based on states, what different states have to contribute, and the three principles that are most commonly endorsed are the polluter pays principle, the beneficiary pays principle, and I'm pretty sure I've forgotten the last one now, the ability to pay principle. So basically, traditionally, it would look like those who pollute most have the greatest responsibility, but then some of those who have been historical polluters are no longer very big polluters and have less capacity, for instance, the former Soviet bloc. So usually, then polluter pays principle is somewhat modified by also sort of superimposing a capacity to pay principle, and then ultimately also a beneficiary pay, so those who benefit principle. So we could think that should equally apply to individuals. It's a bit harder for individuals as well. Not everyone who lives in a carbon-intense economy like ours has, the great ability to reduce their carbon footprint, because we are obviously amongst us, there's big differences as well. Not only in the extent to which we perhaps contribute to pollution, but also to the extent to which we can make changes. So, if your work situation or living arrangements just involves having to commute by car or whatever, then that it might be, depending on your income, you may not be so flexible in terms of moving somewhere else, or getting, so generally but that's a very difficult question to decide in the abstract for individual people. For states, that's obviously been tried to do, because we had to have some principles on which these contributions were decided. Yeah, and those were the principles that are usually endorsed, and then they are also then mitigated and balanced against other principles to do with development. So obviously that we would not stymie the development potential of nations, developing nations, for instance. And then there's obviously a principle sometimes invoked by sort of newly developed nations to some kind of principle of equality, so some kind of right to pollute in order to achieve similar standards of living. These are all very contentious, obviously. They're very difficult decisions to make, but roughly those are the principles that are being used at that level. And obviously most of us wouldn't go through such an intricate calculation to look at our own ability. So I guess, philosophers don't have a formula, as you know, to determine those. So, but generally, with greater responsibility comes, obviously, or with greater capacity comes greater responsibility. And one thing I did mention earlier that was also identified by Christine McKeon was the importance of first movers or trendsetters. So these are the people who perhaps go against the current and say, no, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, or I'm going to change my behaviour, and I'm going to do so very publicly, so as to send a signal. There's a lot of debate about the hypocrisy of virtue signaling recently, but I kind of think if it's obviously just a hollow signal, where I'm just signalling without actually really following through, okay, that's not worth much. But actually in this debate, virtue signaling seems to be a good thing in that it may get other people to copy the so-called pro-social behaviour that we're after.
And can I just ask a quick question? So,
Yeah.
I know we've only got a few minutes left, but you talk about first movers, and that made me think of Extinction Rebellion. Are you familiar with Extinction Rebellion?
I know, I'm not sure how familiar, but I obviously know of them and what they've been.
Okay, so is that an example of first movers, and what are your thoughts on their approach?
Here's what I know of their approach. So is that they take sort of quite radical, quite public, direct action where they try to sort of disrupt.
That's right.
And they try to draw attention to certain issues by disruption, and it sort of borders civil disobedience, or is civil disobedience. Okay. Well, look, I find that very refreshing, to be honest. But I think we're at the point where especially in this country, where civil disobedience is called for. Yeah. And so I have a lot of sympathy for a lot of those things. Obviously, I'm not that familiar with each of their individual campaigns, but yeah, no, that's calling. I mean, yeah, calling attention to these issues, even if it's through disruption, seems to be in principle a good thing. Hopefully, if it's having an effect as well, that would be desirable.
A couple more questions. So Cam had one.
I just wondered, this says that answers to students, that's no question at all.
Maybe they just don't dare say it.
So they know probably what one another think, they have their own convictions.
Yeah.
Is this reflected in their behaviour?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I have had discussions with them about it, and it's been a while though. I don't remember. It's not that I kind of think, it's not that I've had, let's just say I've had no moment where I thought, oh, you're saying you're on board with this and now I see you do this thing which goes against that. I've not observed behaviour that would contradict that, but I'm also not.
Yeah, I just wondered how they would compare to, say, the general population in their behaviour.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So here's one thing I can say. So I have had various students over the past couple of years who said they couldn't come to class because they went to Extinction Rebellion or other climate change marches. And I would say, okay, cool, that's good. I want you to do that. I think that's important. And so yes, so I can see that some of them are seriously following through with their convictions, but I'm not sure how typical that is across the board. But definitely have had quite a few wanting to participate, be very active.
So, the 19th century philosopher, William James, in his 1896 lecture on the open belief, he said that we have to believe in each other in order for the society to actually work. Do you think if we do like our little bits without actually believing other people will do their bits, because at the moment, like about 50% of the world population that actually believe in climate change. Will it actually make a difference?
So William James said we have to believe enough in each other, and then society.
I think he said like in the will to believe, he said that we have to believe in each other in order for the society to actually work.
Yeah. No, and I'm hoping that everything I've said was said or kind of in that same spirit.
So if people believe our little bits, but we don't believe it, that other people will do their bits, will it actually work?
No, so that's a crucial point, and it's a crucial point also for our ability to. When I talked earlier about these two different frames that we can adopt, so the so-called individualist versus the collectivist frame, and I said we do in fact adopt both depending on the context. So we often do sort of reason or infer our individual course of action from what we think is optimal as a collective outcome. And whether or not we do that depends on circumstances, and one of the circumstances, or one of the aspects or the criteria that will influence that is whether or not I believe that others will also either do their share or that others agree with this particular, or also endorse this particular collective goal. And that's why it's so important that we combat some pluralist ignorance, because the moment we are unaware that others endorse the same goal, we actually have very little reason to then make a contribution to what's collectively optimal, and we may choose and sort of a path that is only individually optimal and that is collectively suboptimal. So that's a really good point, because it is in knowing what others believe and also encouraging others to share our views and perhaps to also to basically talk to each other, that we sometimes form not just collective goals but also plans, shared plans on how to achieve collective goals. So that's what we do on a regular basis in small groups. Let's say we just set the table, we'll go like, oh, let's group together, you do this, I do that. We do that all the time. We set a collective goal and then we distribute individual contributions to enact our shared plan. And so at the larger level, that makes a massive difference. Obviously, if I believe that others endorse the same goal and are also willing to do their share. So yeah, thank you. Good question.
Okay.
I think we need, I know Ray's got a really good question.
Well, you sort of think about where political power sits in our world, and my thinking about it is who benefits from, the economy and society. Who are the main beneficiaries who get the extreme good end of the pineapple, so to speak, and they get that because they have enough political power to sort of co-opt the resources and accrue those benefits. So, we're told normally we live in a democracy, which is a pretty nebulous term, but in actual fact, if you look at who benefits the most, it's basically 1% corporate sort of interest. So in terms of how do we politically act to have any influence at all? Politicians, as I said, are gatekeepers to serving the core political interests that basically ensure that we can't challenge their interests and we remain powerless, and it's sort of completely overwhelming to take that on.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. But that's it's just the sense of individual powerlessness that it can be quite overwhelming for sure. I mean, it is. This country does hold free elections every 3 years, so there is an opportunity. It's not the greatest, and you might not think the options are all particularly good, but that is obviously a chance to make a change to who's governing the country. But that's sort of perhaps partly misses the point, because you're saying, well, there's still vested interests that are not subject to elections, and we don't elect those people who hold a lot of the economic power in the country. And that's something that grassroots fight have been successful, obviously, at some level, and but it's a very unequal fight for sure. And so I don't know what to say other than I think we can chip away at that, and perhaps one of the things that I try to say is even if we can't solve the problem overall, we can still make some improvement to it, and maybe that's the way to not lose faith, to just look at the things you can do, even though it's not going to ultimately fix the problem as a whole, but it may cause some improvement. That's unfortunately all philosophy can say in terms of encouragement. But thank you. It's a good point.
We'll have to wrap it up, but please join me in thanking Dr. Anne Schmeck. We really appreciate you taking your time to come out and speak to our community tonight. Transition Town Guildford is all about supporting or building a strong local area, and we're all about local food. So we have an urban market gardener, Pippa Islands, who grew this from seed. It's a Tommy Toe cherry tomato plant. So This is a gift to you. It's so much something. I also want to thank all of you for coming. I found myself saying to my husband yesterday, no one cares about climate change. You're all here, you care, and that just makes me feel good. I want to thank the people that helped set up this event tonight. We had Emily, Kathy, Chris, Colin and Georgie and Peter. Big round of applause. And Steve. Chat, safe travels.